The sediment was wet when they walked across it. Between 19,000 and 23,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial period, when the world's ice sheets had locked up enough water to drop sea levels by more than 100 meters, and the climate of Australia's interior was cold and dry in ways that would be unrecognizable today, a group of people crossed a shallow, moist clay surface near the shores of the Willandra Lakes in what is now western New South Wales. Adults, adolescents, and children moving across the wet ground. Their feet sank into the soft surface with the exact pressure of their bodies, the exact dimensions of their feet, the exact biomechanical pattern of their individual gaits. Some were running. The researchers who would eventually study the prints could tell this from the depth and distribution of pressure across the different sections of each track. Someone was moving fast, someone was covering ground. Then the clay dried. The prints hardened, sediment covered them, and they stayed there, sealed, preserved, unchanged, for 20,000 years while everything above them transformed beyond recognition. In 2003, a young Muthi Aboriginal woman named Mary Papin Jr. was walking across the dunes of Mungo National Park when she noticed something pressed into the exposed sediment. She brought it to the attention of archaeologists. What followed was one of the most significant discoveries in the history of Australian paleontology. More than 700 fossil human footprints, 400 of them grouped in a continuous set of 23 trackways, spread across an area of approximately 700 square meters, the oldest human footprints ever found in Australia, and the largest collection of Pleistocene-era human footprints anywhere in the world. They were dated by the same optical luminescence methods that had been transforming our understanding of ancient Australian archaeology, and the result was unambiguous. These prints were between 19,000 and 23,000 years old, made at the last glacial maximum, made by people whose descendants, through an unbroken thread of culture and knowledge and biological inheritance, are still walking across this same country today. Mary Papin Sr., a Muthi, tribal elder and the mother of the woman who found them, said something when asked about the prints that encapsulates the entire significance of the discovery. "We did not die 60,000 years ago," she said. "We are still here. Those prints at Willandra Lakes are extraordinary. They are a direct physical record of the human body in motion, more intimate in some ways than any tool or stone artifact could be, because they capture not the product of a human hand, but the act of a human body moving through a landscape. But they are not the oldest evidence of human presence in Australia. They are not even close to the oldest. And the full story of how our species first arrived on this continent, when it happened, how it happened, and what those first arrivals were already capable of when they got here, is a story that has been quietly dismantling one of the most deeply held assumptions in the history of human evolutionary science. That assumption was that Australia's first people arrived approximately 47,000 years ago. It was a reasonable estimate, supported by what the archaeological record appeared to show through most of the 20th century. Most sites across the continent dated to between 43,000 and 54,000 years ago. The distribution of dates seemed to suggest a settlement timeline that began in the late Pleistocene and gradually filled the continent over the following millennia. The model was coherent. It was taught. It became the settled answer. Then the excavations at Majid Bebe began to go deeper. Majid Bebe is a sandstone rock shelter located at the base of the Arnhem Land Escarpment in Australia's Northern Territory, within the traditional lands of the Mirarr people, in the area that now forms part of Kakadu National Park. The site has been known to Western researchers since its discovery in 1972, and excavations had been conducted there in 1973 and 1989, with results that already suggested considerable antiquity. But the major excavations, conducted between 2012 and 2015, covering an area of 20 square meters, and reaching a depth of 4 meters, produced something that the field was not prepared for. The excavation team, led by Professor Chris Clarkson of the University of Queensland and conducted in partnership with the Mirarr people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, recovered artifacts organized into 3 distinct bands of occupation at different depths in the sediment. More than 10,000 stone artifacts were recorded, with their 3-dimensional coordinates logged using a laser total station. Artifact refits. Instances where 2 broken pieces of a stone tool were found to join together, confirming they had not moved far from where they had been made, demonstrated the stratigraphic integrity of the deposit. The layers had not been mixed or disturbed. What was deep was genuinely old. The dating was conducted using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures the last time individual grains of sand were exposed to light, effectively the moment they were buried. Single-grain OSL dating, applied to hundreds of individual quartz grains from the lowest occupation horizon, produced a result that was published in the journal Nature in 2017 and immediately generated both celebration and controversy in the scientific community. Human occupation at Majid Bebe began around 65,000 years ago, not 47,000, not 50,000, 65,000, 18,000 years earlier than the previous accepted timeline. earlier than any previous confirmed human presence in Australia. Earlier, in fact, than the existing model for when modern humans dispersed out of Africa would comfortably accommodate. The 65,000-year date was not a slight revision to the accepted timeline. It was a complete restructuring of it. But what made the Majid Bebe finding so much more than a date revision was not the number itself. It was what the people who left those artifacts were already doing 65,000 years ago. The lowest occupation layer at Majid Bebe, the one dated to 65,000 years ago, contained a behavioral archive that should not have existed under the prevailing model at that point in human cognitive and technological history. The site yielded the world's oldest known edge-ground stone hatchets. These are not crude, unworked rocks. They are stone tools whose cutting edges have been deliberately ground and polished to produce a sharp, durable working surface, a technological process that requires conceptualization, planning, access to appropriate grinding materials, and execution. For decades before the Majid Bebe discovery, edge-ground axes were thought to have appeared much later in the human story. Their presence at 65,000 years old forces a fundamental reconsideration of when this technology emerged and where. Alongside the hatchets were the world's oldest known seed grinding tools, stones used to process plant seeds into edible food. The microscopic and chemical analyses that the research team later published in scientific reports, examining 104 of the grinding stones recovered from the site, identified the earliest known evidence for seed grinding and intensive plant processing anywhere in the human record. The people at Majid Bebe 65,000 years ago were not opportunistic foragers grabbing whatever came to hand. They were processing plant foods in a systematic, tool-assisted way that implies accumulated knowledge of their environment, knowledge of which plants produce seeds worth grinding, when those seeds are ready, how to prepare the grinding surface, how to store or consume the resulting food. This is not random survival behavior. It is organized food technology. And then there's the ochre. Majid Bebe yielded massive quantities of high-grade red and yellow ochre, found alongside specialized grinding stones and stone axes and reflective mica sheets, in what researchers have described as a highly organized domestic space. The ochre was not merely present, it had been processed. The team found evidence for the mixing of ochre with reflective powders made from ground mica to make a vibrant paint, a compound material with specific optical properties that required deliberate formulation. This is the earliest known intensive use of ground ochre pigments anywhere in Sahul, the Pleistocene landmass that comprised modern Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, when sea levels were low enough to connect them. Ochre is not a food. Ochre is not a tool in any functional utilitarian sense. Ochre is what you use when you're making something for reasons that go beyond immediate survival. You use it to mark a surface, to paint a body, to color an object, to communicate something about identity, status, ceremony, relationship, belonging. The presence of deliberately processed, mixed, and applied ochre pigment at 65,000 years ago in Arnhem Land means that the first Australians were not simply surviving. They were already practicing something that the modern world recognizes as art. This combination, edge-ground hatchets, systematic plant processing, complex pigment preparation, evidence of symbolic and aesthetic behavior, does not describe a minimal, struggling population barely managing to exist in an unfamiliar landscape. It describes a people who had arrived with a fully formed toolkit, a sophisticated knowledge system, and a capacity for cultural expression that placed them at the leading edge of human cognitive development at that moment in prehistory. The question of how they got there is in some ways as extraordinary as the question of when. To reach the landmass of Sahul 65,000 years ago, the first Australians had to cross open water. There was no land bridge connecting the Asian mainland to Australia, even at the lowest sea levels of the last glacial period. The minimum water crossing required, even when accounting for every reduction in sea level that the climate of 65,000 years ago would have produced, was at least 90 kilometers of open ocean. Some estimates, depending on the specific route taken, put the required crossing at considerably more than that. 90 kilometers of open water, at a minimum, in a world where no other human population had demonstrably navigated comparable distances across open sea. The people who made that crossing were not following a visible destination. They could not have seen Australia from the Asian mainland. They were crossing toward something they could not see, driven by whatever combination of intentional exploration, incremental island hopping, accident, or demographic pressure brought them to the edge of the known world and then beyond it. A study published in Science Advances in November 2025, conducted by researchers from the University of Huddersfield and tracing maternal DNA lineages, added genetic confirmation to the archaeological evidence. The study found evidence that humans reached the Sahul landmass approximately 60,000 years ago via two distinct routes, a major northern route and a smaller southern route, presenting one of the earliest cases of deliberate seafaring in the human record. The genetic analysis supported what the archaeological team at Majid Bebe had inferred from the artifacts. The first Australians were not accidental arrivals blown off course by a storm. They were navigators. They had boats or watercraft of some kind, capable of carrying people across 90-plus kilometers of open Pacific Ocean. And they did it successfully enough, in sufficient numbers, to establish a founding population that would endure continuously for the next 65,000 years. That number, 65,000 years of continuous occupation, is worth sitting with. The oldest continuous human presence in Europe dates to approximately 45,000 years ago. The Americas were first reached somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The Aboriginal Australians have been living in their country for 65,000 years without interruption. Through the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets advanced and the climate dried, and the interior of the continent became one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Through the gradual separation of Tasmania from the mainland approximately 12,000 years ago, as sea levels rose after the ice melted. Through the appearance and extinction of megafauna, giant kangaroos, massive wombat-like diprotodons, enormous flightless birds that shared the continent with the first Australians in numbers that no modern ecosystem would recognize. Through all of it, the people stayed. The knowledge stayed. The culture stayed. The 65,000-year date also has implications that extend far beyond Australia itself. It forces a reconsideration of the timeline for when modern humans left Africa. If people were in Australia 65,000 years ago, they must have left Africa, traveled through the Arabian Peninsula, moved through South and Southeast Asia, acquired the seafaring technology necessary to cross open water, and arrived in northern Australia. All of this must have happened before 65,000 years ago. The journey from Africa to Arnhem Land is not short. It required either a sustained, continuous migration or a series of coastal movements that tracked the shoreline of the southern Asian coast, taking advantage of the reduced sea levels of the late Pleistocene to cross what would have been, in many places, much shorter water gaps than exist today. Some researchers have suggested that the coastal route was a kind of highway, that the people who eventually became the first Australians spent tens of thousands of years moving along the southern coast of Asia, adapting to different environments as they went, accumulating maritime knowledge that eventually made the final crossing to Sahul possible. That hypothesis is consistent with the evidence at Majid Bebe, where the sophistication of the toolkit suggests not a population at the beginning of a learning curve, but one that had already mastered several different technological traditions. It is also consistent with what genetics is revealing about the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and other ancient human populations. Aboriginal Australians carry genetic signals indicating a mixture with Denisovans, the mysterious archaic human population whose DNA is known primarily from a fragment of fingerbone found in a Siberian cave, but whose genome has been partially reconstructed, and whose descendants interbred with the ancestors of modern Papuans and Australians somewhere in Southeast Asia. That interbreeding event happened before the crossing to Sahul, somewhere on the coastal route through South and Southeast Asia, and it means that the first Australians carried not only the genetic heritage of modern Homo sapiens, but a contribution from an archaic human lineage that has still not been identified in the fossil record anywhere along that route. This situation now becomes even more complex. In 2025, researchers published a paper in the journal Archaeology in Oceania challenging the 65,000-year timeline on genetic grounds. The authors, Jim Allen and James F. O'Connell, noted that all modern humans, including Aboriginal Australians, carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA from a single interbreeding event with Neanderthals. New genetic clock research suggests that this interbreeding event happened less than 50,000 years ago. If the Neanderthal admixture, which is present in all non-African people, including Aboriginal Australians, occurred after the ancestral population had already crossed to Sahul, then the 65,000-year date is incompatible with the genetic timeline, unless there was an initial crossing at 65,000 years ago by a population that was subsequently entirely replaced by a second wave that arrived more recently and carries the Neanderthal DNA signature. The possibility of a first wave and a second wave, an initial founding population arriving in Sahul at 65,000 years ago, and then being replaced or absorbed by subsequent arrivals carrying Neanderthal DNA around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, is exactly what the pendulum of evidence has been swinging toward. The archaeological evidence at Majid Bebe is clear. The artifacts are old, the dates are robust, but the genetic evidence for the full ancestry of living Aboriginal Australians is equally clear and equally robust. Squaring these two lines of evidence requires a more complex population history than the simple model of a single founding crossing allowed for. What this debate illustrates, more than any specific conclusion it produces, is the nature of what is currently happening in the science of human origins as it pertains to Australia. Every new study, every new excavation, every new DNA analysis adds a layer of complexity rather than subtracting one. The timeline keeps shifting. The route keeps branching. The cognitive and technological sophistication of the first arrivals keeps turning out to be greater than the previous model predicted. And the Aboriginal Australian communities whose ancestors made that crossing and whose knowledge systems have preserved the memory of 65,000 years of continuous relationship with this continent keep being confirmed as the bearers of the oldest living culture on Earth. The footprints at Willandra Lakes are 20,000 years old. Someone was running across wet clay during the last glacial maximum. That person was already the inheritor of 45,000 years of accumulated human knowledge about this specific continent, its plants, its animals, its seasons, its water sources, its spiritual geography. They were not at the beginning of anything. They were deep into a story that had been developing for longer than modern European civilization has existed. Those prints cover approximately 700 square meters of exposed sediment surface. The archaeologists who studied them believe they have uncovered less than 1/3 of the full trackway. The rest still buried under the dunes of the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area. The prints of children are there alongside the prints of adults. A tall, one-legged individual who moved with a gait consistent with an amputated limb was among those who left tracks. Evidence, read from the biomechanics of the footprint pattern, of a person who had survived a major physical disability and had adapted their movement accordingly. Alive, moving. Part of a community that 20,000 years ago, in the middle of a glacial period, was walking across clay near an inland lake in what is now the arid heart of southeastern Australia. The continent is full of evidence like this. More than 765 excavations are active in Australia at any given time, adding new data to a picture that continues to expand in every direction. The rock art of Arnhem Land, much of which has not been dated with precision, and some of which may predate the oldest confirmed dates for European cave art, adds a layer of symbolic and aesthetic evidence to the technological picture from Majid Bebe. The grinding stones found at Nawalabila, also in Kakadu, also on Murar country, are dated as 60,300 years old, the second oldest known grinding stones in the world, confirming that the seed processing technology found at Majid Bebe was not isolated to a single site. The story of how humans first arrived in Australia. When they came, what they were already capable of, who they encountered on the way, and what their presence on this continent tells us about the timeline of the entire human diaspora out of Africa, is a story that is still being written. Every new excavation at Majid Bebe, every new genetic study, every new footprint found exposed by wind and erosion in the dunes of the Willandra Lakes adds another piece to a picture whose full scope we are only beginning to appreciate. What is no longer in doubt is the basic astonishing fact. Human beings were here in Australia, continent-sized and isolated behind 90 kilometers of open ocean, 65,000 years ago. They had already mastered tool technologies that the rest of the world would not develop for tens of thousands of years. They were already processing food with specialized equipment. They were already grinding ochre and mixing it with reflective minerals to make paint. They were already, in some meaningful sense, being fully human. Not primitively, not minimally, but with the full cognitive and cultural range that defines our species. And across an unbroken chain of 65,000 years, their descendants are still here, custodians of the oldest living culture on Earth, walking in the footsteps, literally, of people who crossed an ocean they could not see the other side of and built a civilization in a landscape that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth. The clay remembered the runners at Willandra Lakes for 20,000 years. The sediment at Majid Bebe remembered the hatchet makers and the ochre grinders for 65,000. The descendants of both groups remember them still,